Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate studios of MTN, the Minneapolis Television Network. Man, it's an overcast day, and what people are crying about now is that, we only had 2 clear days in November. I knew there was something wrong with the moods and et cetera. I don't know what December is going to bring. They say this weekend we're supposed to have clear blue skies. Let's hope for the best. What I can tell you right now, politically, in the city of Minneapolis, is what is not enjoying clear skies, if you will. It's the city and the Minneapolis Police Department. This morning's edition of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which has been breaking the stories left and right, has an interesting headline: Precinct Chief Out After Tree Uproar. I know people probably think, why should you be upset about something that was done on a tree? And I had a conversation with a reporter from the Washington Post just a couple of hours ago, and also the Kansas City Star. And that was a question that these reporters were asking me, having some difficulty of understanding maybe the mindset of the African American community about being able, as we were quoted in Saturday's edition of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, that we have a pretty good conditioning about what constitutes dog whistles, if you will. Dog whistles that come about in the name of advanced racism, progressive racism, and just overall racism, if you will. Interesting story, though. LaBoris Janey and Liz Sawyer writing the article. We were not puzzled because we began a series of reflections early last week with regards to sources, information providers, and et cetera. We knew there was big trouble within the MPD. We wondered how the department was going to handle it. By Wednesday of last week, we had a pretty good idea. By Friday, when we granted an interview to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, we were absolutely concreted, if you will, with regards to a cover-up. As we have said on a couple of other occasions to media across the country, the mayor of the city, who I think was unfairly tricked and disrespected, really got a bad call, bad reputation, particularly on late Friday around 2:15, 2:30, when he, thinking that he was being protected, if you will, that everybody had his back, made the statement that he was going to discharge the 2, well, he actually initially said 1, because some within the MPD were not giving him correct information. He did not realize it was actually 2 officers. Actually, it's a whole lot more than that. And you have seen that already. And again, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, New York Times, Washington Post, and other newspapers around the country are raising questions about the temperament, if you will, of city government in the city of Minneapolis. By the way, as a part of continued fallout, the police department had its budget cut by $1.1 million. One of the things that was said to us as we came on set here just a short time ago is that really we wound up breaking the story about how many police officers are going to be furloughed, dismissed, retired, and et cetera. Number is still about 70. And also, we were somewhat saddened by the fact that the MPD in the city of Minneapolis had not indicated to the taxpayers of the city that they are really about 120 officers under power. And I take you back to a number of articles in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in which the leadership of the department had indicated that they had reached numbers of 1,035, 1,050. They would be at 1,100. They would be there with cities like Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Kansas City, and et cetera. That was apparent, well, we're trying to be kind, that was clearly inconsistent with the facts. What should have been express to the readers and the taxpayers of the city of Minneapolis is that after the Super Bowl, a abnormal number of police officers retired, took their pensions and got the heck out, if you will. That's getting ready to happen too when the NCAA Final Four in April is complete. We could very well have a police department that will have a problem struggling to reach 1,000 officers, may be lucky if they stay at 900 or et cetera, which is not consistent with what your insurance carrier, the people who insure your municipality, are comfortable with. In fact, Minneapolis, based on its population of over now 400,000, should be at about 1,100 to 1,200 officers, and in the best of all worlds at 1,250 officers, but it is not. Given what has happened in the last week, and by the way, many within the MPD knew about this tree, quote unquote, incident and et cetera. Star Tribune must be given appropriate credit for joining with us here at MTN in providing information, deep background, if you will, knowledge of what really happened. Now, let's go back to a couple days after Thanksgiving. All right, let's kind of roll into it over the next 50-some minutes. Normally at all your precincts, right after Thanksgiving, the details or the officers at the Pacific 5 precincts began to put up the Christmas ornaments and et cetera. The 4th precinct, unfortunately, placed the declaration of the tree in the hands of 2 Pacific officers who have nothing but disdain for people of color, and particularly for African Americans. In fact, here we are now, this morning, in this paper, this newspaper that we're showing here, today's, the Minneapolis Star Tribune breaks a story that the 2 officers in question are legendary with respect to their tactics, hard conduct, if you will, and their disdain for persons of color, particularly African Americans. In fact, the officer identified as Bone Stucker has, since 2015, had something like, 28, 29 reprimands, disciplinary actions, and et cetera. In fact, one of the people that he had a run-in with where he was very disrespectful is a man who we thought would be a serious contender to become the acting inspector for the 4th precinct, the well-known and respected Charles Adams II, commander, Minneapolis Police Department, 34-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department. But we have found out in the last couple of days that Inspector Charles Adams has some interesting enemies in the department and even in the African American community. I think that we need to be upfront with regards to people saying how much they respect Chief Arredondo and others, but there's not that same kind of respect for Commander Charles Adams, whose brother is a 27-year veteran of the department. His son, who is also the head football coach at Minneapolis North, one of the winningest football coaches, but his permanent job is a Minneapolis police officer, Charles Adams III, are all held in ill repute because of something that happened a number of years ago in which Charlie Adams II, Commander Adams, stood tall. And in fact, I mean, we are now reporting here that that is one of the issues that is being held against Commander Charles Adams, and that he was not considered to be a proper fit to take over as a acting and possibly permanent commander of the 4th precinct. In fact, we find it extremely peculiar, the narrative that has emerged with regards to Assistant Chief Jose, who has a lot of duties, including the budget, if you will, which is in big trouble after the Minneapolis City Council cut $1.1 million from the budget. By the way, in doing that, What the council did, though, I just cannot believe that they should have asked somebody, have cut all of the programs that are extremely important to community policing, if you will. In fact, in a threat that was uttered yesterday by a high-ranking member of the administration, was that if there wasn't a turnout, and I guess it's tomorrow, if you will, there's supposed to be some kind of turnout at City Hall to talk about the budget and other things, that some other programs like PAL, which is a very popular program, the Police Athletic League program, will be cut. And so there is a sense of retaliation and anger and et cetera, because the African American community, joined by supporters, and in a situation examined by media, including we here at MTN, if you will, and for anybody that wants to challenge that or et cetera, go read this past Saturday's Minneapolis Star-Tribune, read the Washington Post, if you will, of yesterday and et cetera, where the African American community has been given some kudos for standing up and calling out the conspiracy. Now, the conspiracy. When on Monday and Tuesday of last week, a week ago, quote unquote today, 8 days ago today, the department found out that this tree situation, as well as the officers involved, had been uncovered by two women of color who approached their council people, representatives, and et cetera. And by the way, one of them, who has been not provided with the kind of respect and notoriety, if you will, that would go to a person that went to the precinct and took the pictures that we all now see that have gone worldwide, if you will, this entire situation of the quote-unquote Christmas tree and just a couple trinkets that were put on the Christmas tree as a part of just a prank. Let me tell you, these two Pacific officers in question that have now been identified in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune this morning, but we can already tell you that they were identified in the Washington Post yesterday, if you will, and other major newspapers around the United States. But the reason that there was cleansing, if you, in fact, we call it scrubbing in the technical world, where you try to scrub as much information as you can, make it disappear, and et cetera. Because on Monday and Tuesday of last week, the commander of the precinct, now quote unquote demoted, and certainly somebody in a very high position of authority within the administration knew that this was coming down, that they were not going to be able to hide what had been identified, what had been discovered, if you will, what had been posted, and et cetera. And so damage control began, if you will. And that damage control included, and you haven't heard much from him in the last 4 or 5 days, the president, Bobby Crow, of the Police Federation, the now ousted commander of the 4th Precinct, if you will, Aaron, have all been, quote unquote, now had conveyed to them that their future and their careers with the Minneapolis Police Department are more than on hold, if you will. So here's what happened. Apparently on mid-Tuesday, the assistant chief, if you will, Jose, who, by the way, has cameras on all of the lobbies of all of the 5 precincts, was aware of this tampering, this racial material that was being placed on the tree, and questions should have been raised. Now, a Lieutenant Hauser was removed yesterday morning. Again, we are taping on a Tuesday from the corporate studios of MTN. Lieutenant Hauser was going to be the initial scapegoat. I mean, let's face it. when he was notified apparently late Sunday night that he was being transferred out of the 4th, and I don't know where they have sent him, because he did not act quick enough in taking down the paraphernalia, if you will, on the tree and ultimately the tree, particularly when the 2 women of color, one of whom is an elected public official, Ms. Felder, to the Minneapolis Board of Education. So we're not just talking about some black folks who hang out on the corner or go to the store with their food stamps and et cetera. We're talking about an elected public official, Ms. Felder, and a second woman of color who we are not going to identify because of issues of safety and threats, who both went to the 4th precinct and photographed the tree. Now that began a series of events on Tuesday, Wednesday, and by the way, those were Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday were hot days because the issue now of the budget had come up, the issue of creating some new departments for some people to have some jobs and et cetera, dealing with preventive violence and et cetera. The fact that the council had served notice, which we exclusively reported here on MTN a week ago today, that there were going to be problems with the budget and et cetera. Some within the administration of the MPD felt that this was more than they could handle, but the mayor didn't. The mayor did. At the point in time, let's say by Wednesday, that the mayor was having whispered to him that there was a serious problem with incidents that bordered on outright racism and et cetera at one of the precincts, the mayor began to make inquiry. Now here's what happened. The mayor was initially told by some, notice we didn't say all, we didn't say the chief of the department, Chief Arredondo, but some positioned themselves to respond to the office of the mayor that there was no problem, everything was okay. Now in the meanwhile, they were hoping that the tree, pictures of the tree would not be posted on social media. Oops, it was. And so by Wednesday night, community, particularly the African American community, was becoming aware that something was wrong, something was going on, that there was disrespect, if you will, a action being directed against the character and the culture of the African American community and et cetera. Now this would be basically Wednesday. Now a couple other things had happened, if you will. We, unfortunately have to get into the business of the history and et cetera, is that one of the most respected law enforcement personnel assigned to the 4th precinct was Lieutenant John DeMonico, who actually just grew up just down the street from these studios, if you will. I knew his family. In fact, I played high school football back in the day. I mean, way back in the day with some of John's uncles, if you will. John DeMonico was on vacation, if you will, and so he was not on the premises. Also, at that specific time, the highest African American officer at the 4th precinct was a Lieutenant Barnes, if you will. He was also on vacation and did not return to the facility until Thursday morning, as did Lieutenant John DeMonico, former president, by the way, of the Police Federation, and a man who actually had been slated to take over command of the 4th precinct, but some, even in our own African American community, had said he was not qualified, they didn't like him, they didn't trust him, and et cetera. I always tried to figure out how some of them reached that determination with some of those that were in place. As example, when Jamar Clark was shot and killed, or was in charge this past summer when Thurman Blevins was shot and killed, and then Mr. Jordan was shot and killed by police officers that had specifically been brought into the precinct to maintain a heavy hand on the Negro problem, the black problem in North Minneapolis. I'm hearing people now, by the way, and we have more than enough time on this program, who are now saying that that Commander Inspector Beard had cleaned up drugs and et cetera on the streets and guns. I don't know where these people have been. There are shootings each and every night in the 4th Precinct, if you will. Many of you know that you cannot have a peaceful night's rest in your homes in North Minneapolis from the gun battles and et cetera, particularly in what we call the 30s and 40s, in other words, the 3,000 blocks, the 4,000 blocks, and et cetera, all the way up to the city limits with Brooklyn Center. The drug situation is out of control. In fact, we have had so many overdoses of young African Americans and older African Americans in just the 4th Precinct alone that people are trying to block the actual numbers from being provided, quote unquote, to the broader community, irrespective of race, creed, color, or national origin, if you will. So all of this rhetoric that is going on now the just dismissed here on the front page of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, as they called him, precinct chief, had been ousted. There were problems even before that. In fact, what had happened on early Monday morning, which was an indication to the outgoing precinct chief that there was big trouble, is that a very respected and up-and-coming African-American lieutenant by the name of Montgomery, whose mother is a legend in law enforcement here in the state of Minnesota. Montgomery is an African-American, if you will. Montgomery was sent in. He replaced Housley, the lieutenant who had a problem getting the tree down in a timely manner and et cetera, and was immediately moved. Now, going back to something that we pointed out, some would have you believe that the decision, and I don't know what the former precinct commander Aaron Beard was thinking when he gave, according to 4th Ward Democratic Councilman Cunningham, when he said that a disciplinary action had been taken in the form of first a reprimand and a order for the officers to be involved in coaching. Heck, these two officers had been involved in so much coaching that it was unbelievable that that coaching had done no good and had not, quote unquote, been able to address the racism and the disdain that these two officers, who are now identified in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and their records of their involvements in shootings of African Americans and et cetera, other kinds of conduct. And I imagine we'll be seeing more because the national media, as we said, we, as example for the last couple of days, have been talking with the Washington Post as an example. In fact, we were quoted in the Washington Post yesterday with regards to the injury, if you will, the damage that has been done between the police department and the African American community. Now, back over to the mayor. Oh, we like to move around like this because there are so many stories, but we are not moving away from the date. So by early Thursday morning, the mayor was hearing these rumors that there was something very bad that had happened. A black elected public official, Ms. Felder, had indicated her concern and outrage with what it was that she had uncovered, if you will, being joined by another woman of color. The mayor started asking specific questions with regards to what was happening, and if this was confirmed, if you will, what would be the consequences and et cetera. Some advised him that the officers could be fired immediately, which of course is not true, if you will, if one knows the policy. We do, sitting in this chair, for we were a part of the committee that redrafted. I hate to have to do this. if you will, because it in many regards is self-serving. But there's so much dishonesty out there right now with regards to what really happened during that period of time immediately following Thanksgiving and the let's put up the tree and let's get the two worst individuals we can find in the precinct to do what needs to be done. And they did that. The one thing they have done, if they didn't do any good policing, they sure have gotten maximum negative publicity across the world. I mean, papers in New Delhi, Bangkok, if you will, Nairobi, if you will, Geneva, Paris, if you will, Prague, Czechoslovakia, have been writing about the Christmas tree, and how mean-spirited it is that the people who are law enforcement in the city of Minneapolis are with regards to dismissing the importance of, fellowship and et cetera against the African American and other communities of color. So the mayor, being a young man, in other words, that he is a part of the, the current millennium and all of that, had a pretty good idea, though, of what was about to come. He was asking for reassurances. This is the mayor of our city, was asking for reassurances that the appropriate conduct would be taken. Well, at some point, somebody at very high rank conveyed to the mayor that everything was taken care of. Now, this was exposed in Saturday's edition. Hope you're writing it down, jotting it down, or recording these programs so you can go back and verify, if you will. The Saturday edition reported an interview with Councilman Cunningham, Democratic councilman from the 4th Ward. Cunningham at that point said, if you will, in that edition of the paper, that he had been assured by the then commander of the 4th Precinct, Aaron Beard, that appropriate action had been taken, that there had been a reprimand in a form of probably a letter of discipline or et cetera, as well as the two officers who had a long history, if you will, of abusing the rules and regulations, but were also very good friends, buddies, maybe even rode motorcycles together with the group known as City Heat, if you will. Oh, that's a story in and of itself. There are some of you, many of you out there that know all about the motorcycle gang known as City Heat. But protection had already begun. There clearly had been a series of meetings at some level of, I hate to say it, but it's a fact, at some level above the former inspector of the 4th Precinct, Aaron Beard. Because the policy of the Minneapolis Police Department as it pertains to rules, regulations, actions, and et cetera, indicate that the precinct commander would not have had the statutory authority to have ordered, quote unquote, disciplinary action and coaching and et cetera. Commander Beard didn't have that authority. That was an authority that was at a much higher level than even the inspector of the 4th Precinct, who is now per se gone, if you will. So by early Friday morning, the mayor was indicating that he intended to make an absolute declaration and et cetera and show, quote unquote, all communities, but particularly the African American community, that he was a man of purpose, a man of commitment, a man of compassion, a man of understanding, and a man of power, if you will. Unfortunately, his power, quote unquote, was tampered with because his staff in the early, well, actually the late evenings of Thursday, but by the early mornings of Friday, his staff, if you will, was indicating to him this significant move that was going to be made, where he was announcing that the two officers, though I think the mayor in his deep subconscious knew that there were probably more than two involved in the whole Christmas tree atmosphere. And if, in fact, the department and the city attorney are prepared to release the video of the lobby of the 4th Precinct, you will, unfortunately and tragically for the African American community, and officers of all colors and persuasion who are about fairness and respect, the number of officers that for about a 4, 5, 6 day period thought that that was the greatest joke in the free world. But it was not a prank, because the two officers who were the masterminds and who then were protected by higher-ups in revealing, quote unquote, their subterfuge and etc., those officers are officers who are beyond the pale. And again, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in this morning's edition of their paper, and also papers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and others. And so when the mayor around 2 o'clock p.m. made the statement to a couple of reporters that he was going to, that the officers would be fired, I knew at some point in reading the transcript that the mayor was being jerked around, if you will, that he did not know the actual number because he kept saying the officer. It was officers, if you will. By 2:30 on Friday, the mayor was informed, I assume by his chief of staff, that the mayor had been burnt, if you will, and that the officers had already allegedly been sanctioned, punished, disciplinary action taken, and that you could not place them in double jeopardy based on the rules, regulations, and articles of contract between the City of Minneapolis Police Federation and etc. Now, of course, the mayor was stunned. He left City Hall and actually came that Friday evening to the site of what was the 18-day occupation of the grounds in and around the 4th Precinct in November of 2015, if you will. The mayor attempting to explain what had happened, that he would not be able to fire the officers short of carrying out the process, and also short of the Federation, who already was planning its strategy, would be able to go into court and block any termination of these officers and any others who were party to the conspiracy to cover up. We had a call on one of our national radio programs Saturday morning from some people that were clearly pretty sharp, and they questioned us in studio on the Saturday morning program that we do from here in the Twin Cities across the world, if you will, about the issue of double jeopardy, and how was it that the mayor was not informed of the total history of these officers and possibly others that were involved and were making the statements such as, stick it to them, ha 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 ha, what a surprise, and etc. So the mayor had to backtrack, and I'm quite sure that that's one of the things that led to the swiftness of the purging of the quote-unquote commander of the 4th Precinct, but it may also have been a reason that it was decided that Assistant Chief Jose take on the responsibility, in which I do have a feeling, Assistant Chief, I don't know what title to impose upon you. You're Assistant Chief and Inspector. That is unique and unprecedented in the history of the Minneapolis Police Department. But I'm quite sure that there is a test and an evaluation that is going on with regards to Assistant Chief Jose, because one of the things that Internal Affairs, the entity that now has to, quote unquote, go all the way back and make a determination of what really happened in regards to this entire escapade, if you will, that who was it in the command of the Minneapolis Police Department who signed the necessary document as is required by contract, indicating to the officers that certain disciplinary action had been taken against them, if you will. Who signed that document, if you will? Who authorized? As we said before, and we stand by it, that under the policy, under the contract, and etc., that former precinct chief / commander Aaron Beard could not have issued or authorized that, if you will. If he did, then Internal Affairs has hopefully received in the portfolio of evidence, if you will. Yes, you begin to gather your evidence. You'd begin to talk to who it is you need to talk to. By the way, you're going to have a tough time dealing with the president of the Police Federation because of certain precedents that are in place with regards to certain protections that the head of the union has as it pertains to investigations, particularly any investigation that may surround the head of the union, if you will. And so it's going to be a difficult challenge for Internal Affairs to compile the data, assess, if you will, and then provide a report to the chief. But we all have to believe that the mayor, if you will, is going to expect to get his copy of that same report without any redactions whatsoever. Now, that takes us back to the final hours as things began to fall apart at the 4th precinct, if you will. Media has descended upon the mayor's office, if you will. They've descended upon the chief's office. They've descended upon deputy chiefs and et cetera, who should have had the chief's back, who should have had, damn sure, should have had the mayor's back so that the mayor of the city, who is a first-term mayor, first year, he's in his first year. And to be greeted like this as we move into the holiday seasons, I'm quite sure that he had some friends of his who, quote unquote, are his advisors and et cetera, such as the Kaplans, as an example, who think greatly of the mayor, if you will, think that he has a bright political future in politics here in our beloved Shangri-La, the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis and St. Paul and et cetera. And yet the mayor was blindsided. And you know, the other piece of it that is troubling, and we had a brief discussion here at MTN even, is that the mayor himself is a legal practitioner. He is a lawyer, an attorney at law. And, you know, tradition of those that are trained in the discipline and the art of law says that one of the things you do is you kind of look and you check the law books to make sure that when you start talking about, I'm going to fire and et cetera and et cetera. Now, the Federation is digging in. I mean, come on, the Police Federation is digging in. They intend to mount a fierce defense, quote unquote, of their comrades, their compadres, if you will. This will be similar to what happened in the situation in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where 2 white officers made very disparaging remarks about the sexual preference, the gender, and et cetera, of then Chief Janae Harto. But Chief Harto came down hard. Those officers wound up spending $80,000 of their own money and still lost, if you will. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure what the Internal Affairs unit is going to find, if you will. Again, we had a caller on our worldwide and national program on Saturday morning here from the Twin Cities suggest to us that they watch situations like this very closely, and they said that some scrubbing, technical, electronic scrubbing had gone on. Reading the article in this morning's edition of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, precinct chief out after tree uproar, one has to feel that some scrubbing has gone on, if you will, and that there is every attempt to at least minimize. Now, as we said earlier, it was quite clear that initially, let's say on Wednesday and Thursday of last week, that Lieutenant Housley was going to be the scapegoat, if you will, because he did not act with speed and dispatch and speed to take the tree down, if you will. Only problem was the lieutenant oftentimes saw the chief and commander of the precinct walking through the lobby, laughing with the rest of the boys, if you will, about the declarations that were on the tree and what they implied as it pertains to the community that they allegedly are supposed to protect and serve, if you will. Now, we also have a number of leaders in my own community who are now attempting to tell the national and world media, and if there's newspapers out in the galaxy, that they discovered this situation. This is not true, my friends. And people need to be extremely careful given the sensitivity of what is happening, given the political volatility of what is in play. They need to be extremely careful with regards to the quote unquote their honesty, integrity, and conduct. Now, let me say this. I hold and subscribe to the fact and the point that I would have thought that given the pain that the African American and then other communities had suffered, that the opportunity to, for the first time since Don Banham was the commander, African American, of the 4th Precinct, and before him was not Lee Edwards, if you will. And I actually go all the way back to Jones, if you will. That's 30 years ago. One would have hoped that an African American officer of rank would have been considered to have taken command, just as they moved young Lieutenant Montgomery in on early Monday morning to bring some semblance of order and no nonsense. We would have thought, and we like to have thought, that Commander Charles Adams II of the Minneapolis Police Department, 34-year veteran, would have been one of those that would have been certainly seriously considered to be brought in and to take over the 4th Precinct in the neighborhood that he was raised in. Commander Adams, who basically has been stripped of his command to the extent of the budget cuts and et cetera and other things that have happened, was born and raised, let me repeat that again, born and raised in North Minneapolis, grew up in the projects, the tough projects. I keep hearing these people from other places, even my hometown of Kansas City and Chicago and places talk about the tough projects. All projects are tough in America, my friends. I don't care who you are, black, Latino, Hispanic, Asian, and et cetera. You get in them projects, you better know how to survive. But Charlie Adams will never be considered for anything of that particular level because of the vendetta that has been carried out against his brother, who is a 27-year officer, decorated, who, by the way, it was suggested to yesterday that the PAL program, which he founded, which he has nurtured, which is one of the most acclaimed youth programs in the United States of America, that the PAL program could possibly be gutted, if you will. Also, Charles Adams II's son, Charles Adams III, school liaison officer in Minneapolis North, well respected, if you will. Also the head football coach of North High School, and et cetera. But apparently people are saying that it is time for revenge on the Adams family, if you will. Charles Adams' daughter was about to become a Minneapolis police officer last year when there were a series of circumstances which we reported on for all those that say that folks are making things up. We reported on that in the early part, actually, of 2017, what had happened to Commander Charles Adams' daughter, how she was forced out of the police department and moved on, if you will, though hopefully she will decide to take the necessary tests. But let me tell you a story about how vendettas work. You need to know this, particularly those of you out there who are part of the millennium, that half of you weren't even born when some of these things were happening, and it was tough. It was tough to be an African-American police officer in the Minneapolis Police Department, and they didn't have any more than 10 or 12. In fact, I grew up coming out of high school in the 1950s. They had 6, and they thought that was a tremendous number, when the traditional number going back to the 1900s, if you will, had been no more than 3 Negroes in the Minneapolis Police Department. So it has been a tight chore. And in fact, keep in mind that Chief Arredondo, Commander Adams, Lieutenant Hamilton, and now retired Commanders Lee Edwards, no relationship, and Commander and former Deputy Chief Don Harris, who retired because of medical conditions and et cetera, sued the city of Minneapolis. That's what the Mill City 5 was all about. For those of you that pretend like you don't know what the Mill City 5 was, go back and call up City Pages and take a look at the outstanding story done by City Pages and also the Minneapolis Star-Tribune of 5 officers who stood their ground. Charlie Adams, though, has become a target of a very mysterious group of individuals, both community and some within the department, who have done everything to destroy his career. And here's the reason that it happened. And we have basically about 14 minutes left on this afternoon's program. 30-some years ago, about 32 years ago, Charles Adams II is a 34-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department, was a young, bright star, if you will, joining the Minneapolis Police Department, having graduated from Golden Valley Junior College, attended the universities, got his master's degree, if you will, and et cetera. But 32 years ago, he was a member, and this was interesting because the 2 individuals that are being looked at right now by the department to become the permanent inspector of the 4th precinct are both SWAT team members, if you will, and one of them, if you will, Peterson, Billy Jack Peterson, are notorious for believing to be hard, if you will, and keep their foot up, you know, the communities behind. And so Commander Adams was a member of the SWAT team, one of the few, that's another piece that we don't like to talk about here, that we dealt with when we were monitoring for the Department of Justice, if you will, the PCRC. Officer Adams was a member of the SWAT team, and there was a raid one day in North Minneapolis. Boy, that North Minneapolis takes a pounding. In North Minneapolis, there is, for those of you that know the city, if you will, there is a former motel, small motel, there in the area of Sheraton and Russell on Golden Valley Road. For those of you that know the city of Minneapolis, I don't know if you know the history, and I don't know if a lot of you will ever learn it, but what happened was there was a raid on that little motel. Now that motel, by the time of this incident, 32 years ago or thereabouts, had become a low-income apartment, quote-unquote, complex. Some of the units had been changed into bedrooms, small kitchenette, little small living room, bathroom, and et cetera. There was a raid that particular day, 30-some years ago, and the police, happens all the time, agents know that, don't they? Unit went to the wrong apartment, if you will, and in that apartment was an elderly, I'm talking about in their 60s, African-American couple named Smollard and Weiss. See, probably 85% of you out there don't even know about this because your history is being scrubbed also and purged. The police stormed in to the apartment that Mr. Smollard and Miss Weiss were in. It was early in the morning, very, very early, if you will. They were in bed, asleep. Officers came in, a Pacific officer who in fact just died quietly about a year and a half ago, stormed into the apartment, and what had happened, the police back in those days, believed in using every means necessary. We were still fighting, if you will, for the rights of the African American, the sons and daughters of the African American. This particular officer stormed in and he threw a grenade, if you will. The police later said they thought it was a gas grenade. It was a fragment grenade, if you will, an incendiary grenade, which explodes and sends pellets of fire. This officer threw the grenade. It exploded. Mr. Smallard and Miss Weiss realized that something was happening. They were in their early 60s, so they weren't as brisk, as folks would like to think that they should have been in their 60s. The room began to fill up with smoke and etc. And a young officer, member of the Pacific Special Unit, African American, by the name of Charlie Adams, attempted to enter the apartment to try to save the two African Americans. He was ordered to stand down and ordered to evacuate, leaving Mr. Smallard and Miss Weiss to burn to death in the apartment. Later, now Commander Adams, who has been identified by some as, can't be trusted and et cetera. It's part of the discussion that's gone on with tearing apart his command and making him really an officer who doesn't have anything to do. He was asked, because he was really the third officer in, he was at the window, if you will. He was asked to write a report which would falsify the true circumstances of what happened. He declined, if you will. Some officers talked in terms of doing something with him. Charlie is not anything soft. His brother's not soft, his son's not soft, and Charlie ain't soft. But he declined, and so for years that has followed him, though many of those that were involved, including, as I said, the officer who threw the grenade. Now, the reason that was important is that what they wanted him to say was that the officer in question had thrown a gas grenade, if you will. Officer Adams, young officer, if you will, looking for a great career, and he has. He's now in his 34th year of serving this city and this department. But he refused to falsify. He refused to dishonor his uniform, his badge, his city, but more importantly, his community, and et cetera, if you will. I have known for years. Oh, by the way, the question is, well, what did you do? I'm the guy that took the matter to the Department of Justice, if you will. I'm the person that worked closely with the Office of the Department of Justice Community Service in Chicago as we desperately tried to get the officer who threw the incendiary grenade into that room, killing those two African-American human beings. Weren't able to do it. That was a difficult period of time and et cetera, way back in the Reagan years and forward and et cetera. But I think it only appropriate today as we move into the last minutes of this afternoon's program that we understand what the norms are and what the norms aren't with regards to how officers of color will be dealt with, how they will be remembered, and how they will be given an opportunity. I've heard people indicate that we have a chief of color and that certainly it should make a difference. Certainly it should. In fact, Chief Arredondo was still a young guy in high school, if I'm not mistaken, when this whole situation of the deaths of Smallard and Weiss. See, many of you, as I said, 85% of you have never heard about Smallard Weiss case because the history books have been closed. The archives have been closed. In fact, it was amazing that the Minneapolis Star Tribune, through the efforts of LaBoris Janey, And Liz Sawyer, somebody told them to go look at the archives and take a look at the names of these officers, if you will. One of the legends of the since departed in the last 24 hours head of the 4th Precinct is that he was looked upon as the top guy with regards to SWAT teams and et cetera. The only problem is the two individuals who are being looked at right now are determined to be individuals who are hard-nosed and are the heart and soul of the SWAT teams and et cetera that operate in these savage and dangerous neighborhoods and et cetera. So we hope that at some point in time the right thing will be done and that someone will be put in charge, not the assistant chief who now carries 5 or 6 titles, including he better make some adjustments to that budget which was cut by the Minneapolis City Council to the tune of $1.1 million. And by the way, we told you on a program just 2 weeks ago about a conversation that we overheard and were present, though the people thought we were too stupid and too dumb to know what it was that they were talking about. But the conversation had a lot to do with the incompetency of black officers in the Minneapolis Police Department. And I know that Commander Charles Adams is not a part of any kind of group such as that. But unfortunately, that is a part of the racism, the cushion of racism that we have to deal with. Well, as we close, let us never be referred to as that race or group of people because we didn't have a clue of the history or anything else. And we are referred to as that race or group of people that have become extinct and no longer exist on the history pages of the city of Minneapolis. On behalf of our very fine production staff, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.